Hey everyone, Kyle with SSV Works. Today we're going to be installing our Phase-5 V-Spec kit on your 2015 to 2024 Polaris Slingshot. Let's get started. You will get our 10-inch behind the seat sub enclosure loaded with our 10-inch marine grade subwoofer, a 1400 watt 5-channel amp, our Lit-CC universal RGB controller, behind the head speaker pods that come with 6.5 speakers, and our front speaker pods that can fit 6.5 or 8-inch speakers. For this install, we're loading the 6.5-inch speakers. You want to pop the hood by releasing the hood tab underneath the front of the car and gently lift up and forward to expose the engine bay. Next, we will disconnect the battery using a Phillips head screwdriver. Moving on to the seats, remove the driver and passenger seat using a 15mm socket and wrench for the front seat bolts. To remove the rear seat bolts, move the seat to the forward position using a 15mm socket for the driver's side. Before removing the driver's seat from the vehicle, make sure to unplug the 2 harnesses attached to the back of the seat. The passenger side seat bolt nearest to the center console will be a 17mm bolt. Be sure to unplug the passenger seat harness as well. Then you can remove the seat from the vehicle by lifting straight up on the seat and carefully setting aside. Your next step will be to remove all of the plastic push pin fasteners from the vehicle's floor and rear wall. Remove the bottom half of the glove box by unlatching the glove box's door hinges from the vehicle. You can begin to disassemble the dash panels, taking out the 2 T25 Torx screws securing the small plastic dash panel. Remove the 2 screws on each side to remove the windshield. Next, you would want to remove the plastic piece near the mirror and remove the mirrors. Use a T40 Torx driver to remove the 8 Torx screws holding the dash panel in. After all of the Torx screws and push pin fasteners have been removed, you can lift the entire dash panel up and away from the vehicle and carefully set it aside. To remove the trim panel around the radio, you will need to remove the 2 push pin fasteners. Then pry up only on the bottom of the panel near the gear shifter. Once that portion is loose, you can pull the rest of the panel towards the rear of the vehicle. Remove the 2 T30 Torx screws securing the radio in. Once the cup holder panel is out of the way, you can pry up on the gear shifter panel with a panel popper or plastic pry tool. Lift the panel up and unplug the gear shifter harness from the shifter and from the back of the radio. Now, using an 18mm socket and extension, remove the 4 bolts holding in the roll cage. Lift the roll cage carefully out of the rear deck panel at the right angle to clear the brackets from the bottom. Moving on to the rear side panels of the vehicle, you will need to remove the 3 T30 Torx screws from the panel. Alright, moving to the rear middle panel of the vehicle, you will need to remove the 1 T25 screw and the 2 T30 screws. Also remove all the push pin fasteners securing the back plastic wall. Be sure to unplug the cigarette lighter connections. Remove the rear wall from the vehicle. You will need to lift the floor panel up and slide the rear wall out from underneath it. You will need to remove the latch for the storage compartment door. This step is only necessary if you are going to put the subwoofer enclosure in the storage compartment. We will now install the LitCC RGB controller. In an empty rocker switch location of your choice, install the LitCC RGB controller. Once you have installed the controller, you can run the wiring up to the front of the vehicle where it will eventually connect to the brain. To mount the LitCC brain, use the supplied zip ties. Once you have routed your controller cable, you can now connect it to the brain. Next, you will plug the BH3734 in between the harness located on the backside of the glove box. This Y-splitter will plug into the BOS SHPGAT, another Y-splitter harness that will leave you with 3 open-ended wires. Use the red and black wires here to power your LitCC brain. Next, you will connect the blue amp, turn on wire with the BH2917, and then finally connect to the BOS SHPGAT, safely securing all wiring harnesses. Now we will install B-H2936 RGB speaker harness for the front pods. Running the cables through the opening near the side view mirror mounting location. Leave the driver's side cable where it is. We will run the speaker harness when we get there. Running the B-H2936 RGB Y-splitter harness for the rear speakers, you will start at the rear deck and then run the harness down the rear wall through the center console towards the front of the vehicle, and about halfway through you can add B-2934 RGB extension harness. Running the harness through the center console going up and under the radio and plugged into output number 2 on the LitCC brain module. Okay, once you have made all of your connections at the LitCC RGB brain module, you can now bundle up and zip tie all of your harnesses together. Before routing the rear RGB and speaker harnesses up to the rear pod location, you will need to drill a hole using an 11/16 drill bit. Route the RGB cable up and under the rear deck and through the hole you just drilled. Keeping away from any moving parts or heat sources, zip tie the cables to any existing factory harnesses to keep the install looking clean. Now you will route the 4-pin connector side of the rear speaker harness B-H2195 to the amplifier location, which will be underneath the passenger side seat. Now you will run the 4-pin end of the rear speaker harnesses B-H2195 down the center console and towards the amplifier's mounting location, which will be beneath the passenger seat. For all of the cables being used for the amplifier, we will begin running them beneath the passenger seat through the factory seat harness opening. These harnesses will loop under the vehicle and come up from the center console, so be sure that you zip tie your wires safely and securely to the vehicle. Be sure there is no slack hanging beneath the vehicle either. Starting at the amplifier location, run B-H1913 through the center console and up to the radio. Then add B-2195 Y splitter being used for the front speaker harness. Coming up behind the radio and running the corresponding plugs to each side. They are labeled for driver and passenger side. At this point, you will be running the B-1587 power and ground wires for the amplifier and a B-1913, which will be used for the amplifier's front channel input. The next step is optional. For systems using a bass knob, now would be the time to run this cable. Continue running the power and ground harnessing through the center console going under the radio and factory amp. The battery is on the passenger side near the wheel. Zip tie the power and ground harness along the frame rail away from moving parts and heat sources. If modification to the length of the power wire is needed, we do provide extra ring terminals for that purpose. At this point, you can install the fuse holder and fuse onto the power wire. Do not reattach the battery or the amplifier's battery wires until the end of the install. For models 2022 and up, they will have this as their factory amplifier. They will use that adapter harness and plug it onto the factory amplifier harness, giving them the input and output for their new amplifier. The factory amplifier is located directly behind the radio. It is silver and black box. Unplug the amplifier's harness, which is a black plug. Then run the SSV Works amplifier's front channel input harness B-H1913 through the center console up to the radio. Plug the provided Polaris to SSV Works adapter onto the factory amplifier's harness, and onto the SSV Works amplifier input harness, B-H1913. Now moving on to the front speaker pods. Start by assembling the mounting brackets to the driver's side kick pod, using 2 M6 washers and 2 M6 screws per bracket. Each bracket is labeled with a D, a DD, or a DDD. The same goes for passenger side, with a P, a PP, or PPP. You can now bundle and secure your wiring in place to the tube of the vehicle, and then make your connections. Place the passenger kick pod into the vehicle, pushing it as far forward as possible. This will allow you to angle in the rear of the kick pod so that bracket P is able to rest in between the factory metal bracket and plastic side panel. Then repeat the same steps on the other side of the vehicle. Now moving on to the subwoofer install. Using a T30 Torx bit, install the brackets to the enclosure with the provided 6 M6 bolts. For 2017 and up models, use the supplied 6 threaded U-nuts on the left and right side to mount the enclosure. Then, using an 11/16 inch drill bit, drill a hole in the bottom of the storage compartment for the B-H2702K subwoofer harness to come through. You can then make your subwoofer harness connections. Now, you can put the subwoofer enclosure into the mounting location, lining the brackets up to the factory screw holes. Making sure your subwoofer harness is plugged in, secured, and away from any moving parts or sharp metal, you can then reinstall the rear beauty panel. Be sure lifting on the floor panel and sliding the rear wall underneath it. Next, be sure to plug in your 12-volt cigarette socket. Next, attach the SSV Works logo plate using the provided T30 Torx screws. For the rear speaker pod install, be Be sure that the T30 torque screws in the opening beneath the pod are secure. Then, plug the white 4-pin RGB harness and the 2-pin black speaker harness into the pod. Do the same for the driver's side. Once the pod is in place and plugged in, reinstall the 2 T25 torque screws, securing the pod to the rear deck. For the driver's side pod, you will follow the previous steps, and you will also need to reinstall the gap gasket and the gas cap onto the vehicle. Then, using your 18mm socket, you can reinstall the 4 bolts holding the roll cage into place. The amp will come with a mounting plate. Apply it to the mounting plate before placing underneath the seat. Place the amp bracket on the passenger side where the seat is. Since we've made all of our connections run to the amplifier, they are now ready to be plugged in. Plug the white RCA into amp 1L and the red RCA into amp 1R. Next, plug B-1587, your 10-foot power and ground harness coming from the battery, to the amplifier's power harness. And plug the 4-pin front speaker output plug into the B-1913, which is an extension harness running to the front speakers. Then plug the 4-pin rear speaker output plug into the B-2195 harness, connecting to the rear pods. Then plug in your blue amp turn-on wire. Then plug the B-H2702K 2-pin subwoofer output harness into the amplifier. Now, before putting anything back together, test the system, play a couple of songs, and make sure it sounds the way you want it to. Once you have checked the audio, you can now reassemble the vehicle. Lastly, make your power and ground connections on your battery. All right, everyone, that's going to be a wrap for our Slingshot install of our Phase-5 kit. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.